Chapter 37 is Chapter 3, the third day, from Part 7, the last week. And Bethany in Jerusalem, Tuesday, the 3rd of April, the 12th of Nisan, AU, I forget what that is, 783, Matthew 21 and 22, and 23, and 24, and 25, and 26, Mark 11, 12, 13, 14, Luke 20 and 21. The morning of the third day found Jesus and his disciples returning to Jerusalem. It would seem to have been dark when they crossed the Mount of Olives the evening before, so dark that they had not noticed the condition of the fig tree, which they had visited the morning previous. But now its appearance arrested their attention. The blight which Jesus shed upon it seems to have begun to take effect at once, and in 24 hours such a change had been wrought that now it was dried up from the roots. Peter, calling the yesterday to remembrance, said to Jesus, "Rabbi, see, the fig tree which you cursed is withered away." The solemn reply of Jesus was, "If you have faith in God, I assuredly say to you, whosoever shall say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, and shall not be divided in his heart, but shall believe in that which he says is coming, it shall be to him. On this account I say to you, all things whatever you pray and ask, believe that you have received, and they shall be to you. And when you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, that your Father in the heavens may also forgive you your trespasses. And remember, both the Father and the heavens part are each a way of separation and distinction from, oneself and the type of being or whatever one is. In the common version of Mark 11, verse 26, there is added, or perhaps it's taken away from the other, but if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. But these words do not appear in the original, in the oldest manuscript. Now, there's been 10,000 variants discovered in the Old Greek for the what they call the New Testament. By Old Greek, I mean, pre-Jerome Vulgate Greek. It is noticeable that frequent and wonderful as has been the exhibition of the powers of Jesus, each fresh display strikes his disciples with astonishment. They had seen the dead raised, and now they are astonished at the withering of a fig tree. Jesus turns them from astonishment at this phenomena to consider the necessary internal condition of a powerful soul to be that of faith in God. A literal interpretation of his words about removing mountains may be quite puzzling, and perhaps we can hardly satisfy ourselves with the suggestion that he pointed to the opposite mountain on which the temple stood, as meaning that by faith his disciples might be sustained in such a course as to lift the mountain of Judaism and fling it out of the way of the progress of true religion. Well, because we find that Judaism and Christianity weren't the religions of the messiahs and prophets and other title and seers or whatever you want to call them. But really the implication is that, hey, if you all group together and have the degree of faith, even in combined sense, you can do the sort of stuff that I did. It is quite natural to suppose that he taught that faith is superior to bodily strength, and that generally the spiritual forces of the universe are superior to the physical, and this is consistent with the spirit of the whole body of his teaching. As for the remainder of his speech, it is a repetition of what we have had in the Sermon on the Mount. The people assembled at an early hour in the temple. There never had been so exciting a feast in the knowledge of the oldest worshipper, and the occurrences of the previous day had increased the excitement. Soon after the arrival of Jesus, the representatives of the ecclesiastical party, the high priest, accompanied by the scribes and the elders, came to him with that same ecclesiastical question. There's no reason to get in there and insult. By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority to do these things? And the same question is asked of fundamentalists today. Well, God gave the authority through the scriptures. The real fundamentalist, not just somebody who's like, closed-minded or whatever people are going to falsely use that term as. The people are going to go straight to the sources and make their own conclusions. Like, well, why were the prophets sent with messages if people couldn't actually interpret them? They have to go find someone else to interpret for you, right? Or someone else to do your ritual that you can physically do yourself. In the evangelists, it is chief priests. Lang says the plural is explained by the then existing relations of the high priesthood. The high priest was supposed legally to enjoy his function during life. See Weiner, Art, Hohe Priester. And before the exile, we read of only one deposition, as far as the Bible lists, 1 Kings 2:27. But since the time of the Syrian domination, the office had often changed hands under foreign influence. It was often a football of religious and political parties, and sometimes even of the mob. This change was especially frequent under the Roman government. Thus, Annas became the high priest 7 years after the birth of Christ. Dion, I wish you wouldn't abbreviate some of these things. 7 years later, Ishmael, at the command of the Roman procurator, according to Josephus' Antiquities 18:22, afterwards Eleazar, son of Annas, a year later, one Simon. And after another year, Joseph Caiaphas, a son-in-law of Annas. Thus, Caiaphas was now the official high priest. But in constancy with Jewish feelings, we may assume that Annas was honored in connection with him as the properly legitimate high priest. This estimation might be further disguised by the fact of his being at the same time the Sagan, or vicar of the high priest, Lightfoot, or if he was the Nutshia, president of the Sanhedrin. Wiesler, compare, however, Weiner, sub Sanhedrin, that, in fact, high respect was paid to him, is proved by the circumstance that Jesus was taken to him first for a private examination. John 18:13, because he was acknowledged, at least people considered him a rabbi, and he taught from Torah, and, it's better to set people aside and say, hey, this public shaming stuff kind of needs to stop. And thus, he here appears to have come forward with the rest in his relation of colleague to the official high priest. Moreover, the heads of the 24 classes of the priests might be included under this name. Probably the whole was the result of a very formal and solemn ordinance of the council, at whose heads stood the high priests. It ought not so much to surprise us that the bigots of the old narrow Judaism should ask these questions as that nonsense of propounding them should have been perpetuated through 18 centuries and be in as full force in London and New York today, not to say in Rome as it was in Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. Now, bigotry and staying upon your own path aren't the same thing. Now, if you could say, as if in all ages of the world the knowing of any truth does not give to him that knows the authority to proclaim it. As if in all ages the possession of any moral power to do good does not give the possessor the right to exert that power. Okay, see, that, people who say that it doesn't, would take issue with that. We're worthy to do whatever we're worthy to do. Isn't that the point of Jesus and Muhammad and Zoroaster and Moses and stuff? That Moses really was the Egyptian priesthood, Hey, it's not just for you, As if the luminousness of the intellect of Jesus and the manifest control he held over the physical world did not lift him out of the circle to which these stupid and powerless churchmen could, with any propriety, address such a question. No, that was the thing. They had power. They had intelligence. And perhaps somebody comes and, well, this isn't what we've been saying, So their pride was hurt. It wasn't that they were stupid, but they had just that dullness of spiritual perception which ordinarily accompanies narrow cunning. The latter trait appears in them. They hope to give him trouble by a dilemma. He might put forth some claim which would conflict with the acknowledged canons of the Church. Any claim he could make, they supposed would do that, or if he could show no credentials, he would lose his hold upon the people. It is to be noticed that when the zeal of Jesus led him in the first instance and in the beginning of his ministry to purify the temple, the church party demanded a sign. Now for the space of 3 years he had been filling his ministry with marvels and signs and wonders and miracles. It would make them ridiculous to demand a sign so near the very spot where Lazarus was raised from the dead. They now perversely demand his authority. In their own nets were their feet entangled. Jesus submitted a counter dilemma. They claimed to be the body set to judge the right of teachers and prophets to fulfill their vocation. Jesus determined that as they had publicly challenged him, they should as publicly demonstrate their capability of sitting in judgment on such cases. With that view he submitted to them a case well known to them. To him, and to the multitude who were listening, in the case of John the Baptist, Jesus said, I also will ask of you one question, and answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, was it from heaven or from men? Answer me. All the people knew John. So did the Sanhedrin. It was a sudden question in the field of theocratic investigation. They saw the dilemma and held a short private consultation. For a report of this consultation, we are probably indebted to Nicodemus, who was a member of the Sanhedrin and a private friend to the disciples of Jesus, to whom he probably communicated what had passed in this consultation. Now there was a Nicodemus, was it 160s or something like this, around the time that the Didache was written, that wrote what we call the Gospel of Nicodemus. And people confuse him with being, the Nicodemus of that time, but is really written, even after some of the, the last of the canonical Gospels was written in 150, but then again, they were all changed after the Nicodemus was changed. So Jesus silently awaited their answer. The multitude were too deeply interested to disperse. The Sanhedrin had only 2 courses from which to elect: to retire and leave the field to Jesus, or shape some reply. It was a question which demanded a categorical answer. Should it be from heaven? They knew Jesus would reply. Why then did you not believe him? I'm tumbling here. And they recollected that John had borne the most emphatic testimony to Jesus. They would thus acknowledge John, whom they had rejected, but if they did so, it would deprive them of all prestige and influence in judging Jesus. The church weighed consequences, not truth. That is, the fashion of the church in every land in all ages. Well, the church is not the same as ecclesiastical authority, because not everybody is a polytheist that worships heroes. Because kirk means a hero shrine, so. But if they should say of men deciding that John had no authority from heaven, that his was a self-assumed office in which he was sustained by his partisans, who also were without divine authority, then they feared that the people would stone them, for the multitude held held John to be a prophet. There was no escape. They saw it and returned to Jesus with the statement, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither do I tell you by what authority I do these things." If they were not able to determine from the whole ministry of John, which was now completed, whether he had God's favor or not, still less were they able to judge Jesus in the midst of this excitement. Their discomfiture was complete. They acknowledged their inability to exercise the functions of the highest office in a theocracy, which office they were ostentatiously parading, and the dignity, the authority, and the power of which they had brought forth to crush Jesus. He appealed from the highest church tribunal to the private judgment of mankind, and is sustained wherever there are candid judges. Now that's what a theocracy should be. In the Islamic idea, everybody has the choice to believe or disbelieve whatever they want, according to the Quran. So so likewise, any theocracy would have to be that they're actually going straight to the revelation and inspiration to justify what they're doing or not doing. And a lot of things would be not allowed for the government to enforce. As Muhammad indicated, some of the worst sins, the worst sins, are ones that there's no punishment for. Murder, child molestation, and rape are certainly even death penalty crimes. But even worse than that are, people without religious sensibility are like, but we take those other crimes more seriously than the secular people do, So, and there's so many other little things that are just, they're big and they pile up, but, He then poured in upon these pretentious churchmen a raking broadside of parables. And for the reply he said, "But what think ye? A man had 2 children, and he came to the first and said, Child, go work today in the vineyard. And he answering said, I will not." Well, see, what are people's abilities, and why would they not, right? Because there's no obligation for children to give up their well-being to serve their parents. To save them from a disaster or something. That's a different story. But then again, no one has well-being in the disaster, trying to flee and escape the flood and whatever. But afterwards, having repented, he went, and he came to the other and said likewise. And he answering said, I go, sir, and went not. Which of the 2 did the will of his father? They answered, the first. Jesus said to them, the tax gatherers and the harlots go into the kingdom of God before you. Well, it starts with actually having the belief, and then what you do when you don't do, that can follow. Not that you don't come with whatever belief and action that you're. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you believed him not. But the tax gatherers and the harlots believed him. But you, when you had seen, repented not afterward, that you might believe him. This was exceedingly severe. These churchmen had expressed a willingness to serve God, as had been shown in their high moral professions and pretensions of legal righteousness. John came an earnest preacher of that very kind of righteousness, urging that it be done from the heart toward God. The scribes and Pharisees showed their insincerity by rejecting just such a preacher, as it is evident they would have hailed with joy if they had not been hypocrites. And when God set the seal of his sanction by the conversion of the worst class of men and women in the community, even then the church authorities rejected him who bore the credentials of the Heavenly Father's approval of his ministry. So it's interesting to capitalize the whole Father thing, but not the heavenly. Abinu is a broader term than that. It takes the Father thing away from it, But then again, the provider of the dwelling and that, But when we're referring to God, it goes broader than that. So perverse was their hypocrisy that when the most convincing proofs of their error came, they refused to repent of the original rejection of John. In general, two classes of sinners are here represented, as in the parable of the prodigal son, the one at first outbreaking, yet afterward repentant and obedient, the other pretending to obedience, going the full length of obedience in speech, while disobedient at heart and in action. The publicans and harlots are the former, hypocrites and churchmen are the latter. Well, let's not insult conservatives too much because they're intending to do the right thing and they're admitting they need some help. It's just their confidence in themselves is lacking a little bit. Jesus continues his pungent appeal to the consciousnesses of his adversaries. He said, "Hear another parable. A man, a householder, planted a vineyard, and made a hedge about it, and digged a wine trough, and built a tower, and let it out to farmers, and went abroad. And at the season of fruit he sent a slave to the farmers, that he might receive from the farmers his share of the fruits of the vineyard. And the farmers, having caught him, beat and sent him away with nothing. And again he sent to them another, and him they wounded in the head and dishonored." Now, what does that mean? And again he sent another, and that one they killed, and many others, beating some and killing some. It can help that's a euphemism for something worse that perhaps puts these individuals guilty of some death penalty crime, right? He had yet one beloved son. He sent him at last to them, saying, "They will reverence my son." But these farmers said among themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." And they took and killed him and cast him out of the vineyard. Now, my heirs don't include my family if none of my family can give proper testimony or even do a basic prayer on their own. If none of my heirs can do that, then it would go to the to the house of worship, right? My things would go to charity to people who could use them. Well, then Jesus put the question, "When then the Lord of the vineyard shall come, what shall he do to these farmers?" From someone burst forth the reply, "He will miserably destroy those wicked men, and let out the vineyard to other farmers, who shall render him the fruits in their season." Someone present exclaimed, "Be it not so," or as the passage stands in our common version, "God forbid." Quoting Psalm 118, verse 22, Jesus said, "Have you not read this scripture? A stone which the builders rejected, the same became a head of a corner. From the Lord this came, and is wonderful to our eyes." Now, people refer to comets as something coming from the Lord, comets and asteroids or whatever. So if that's what that is, but a rock put in a corner, well, there's context about the Ishmaelites, right? If you read this thing further, or at least in one context, the Ishmaelites. And there's also reference to Abraham and, and the direction faced by the followers of Moses and stuff like this. So in Mecca, there's this cube with a rock in the corner. And yeah, it has the same meanings that are usually missed by trying to make it about Jesus. But, the chief priests and Pharisees felt a keenness of the speech against their principles and practices. Well, there's also indication of something that they knew, according to the Jews at the time, knew about Arabia and the Ishmaelites and the cube. And they knew it was a valid place of pilgrimage because some of them actually made it. They were not able to answer him, and therefore sought to silence by killing him, a thing they had already decreed to do. They were determined only by a fear of the people whose enthusiasm for Jesus was still easily excited. Jesus went forward with his parable, so searching and so instructive. He said to them, "The kingdom of the heaven is likened to a king, who made wedding feasts for his son, and sent forth his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast. And they did not wish to come. Again he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the feast.' But they, making light of it, went away, one to his farm, another to his merchandise, and the rest, having seized his servants, insulted and slew them. And the king was enraged, and having sent his armies, he destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then says he to his slaves, 'The wedding feast is ready, but they who were invited were not worthy. Go you, therefore, to the outlets, the roads leading out into the country, and as many as you find call to the wedding feast.' So going out into the roads, those slaves gathered all whom they found, both bad and good, and the bride chamber was fully furnished with guests. And the king, coming in to view the guests, saw there a man who had not on a wedding garment. And he says to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here not having a wedding garment?' And he was speechless. Then the king sent to his servants, having bound his feet and hands, cast him into the darkness, which is without. There shall be the weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few chosen." Now, certainly based on our means, but we should dress appropriately for the occasion, particularly dress in a way that prepares us for the wedding that is our death, That's going to count well for our afterlife. This seems to be an enlarged repetition of a parable uttered earlier in his ministry in the house of the Pharisee. That such a teacher as Jesus often repeated his teachings is what may reasonably be supposed. Well, if he had revelation or inspiration, it wasn't just, he'd repeat it wherever it was to be heard. He represents the heavenly kingdom in the light of a festivity, combining the two images under which the prophets were fond of painting in the reign of the Messiah, namely a feast and a wedding. Compare with Isaiah 25:6, 65:13, Canticles, Song of Solomon, right? 5:1, with Isaiah 61:10, 62:5, and Hosea 2:19. Here it is, a feast given by a king on a special high occasion, the marriage of his son. Hochzeit, high time in Germany, still means a marriage feast. Well, there wasn't technically German at that time, but invitations are issued to great numbers of persons in accordance with Oriental custom. At the time specified, the second invitation is issued. An instance of this appears in the invitation of Esther to Haman to come to a banquet on the morrow, and the sending of a chamberlain at the appointed hour to bring him to the feast. Compare Esther 5:8 with 6:14. And the subjects of this king had been entertaining feelings of rebellion against him, and now they were able to insult him through his messengers. They did not let the occasion pass. Some treated the invitation with contempt, going one to his estate, which he had already acquired, and another to the business which he hoped would enrich him, showing how they preferred their private interests to the will and pleasure of their sovereign. Others wrought up to rebellion, went so far as to kill the messengers of their king. The Pharisees saw in all this that Jesus meant to present a pictorial history of the rebellious Jews, and felt that he was severe on them. But then he began to speak prophetically by describing the burning of the city by the enraged king. Could he be so audacious as to mean Jerusalem, holy Jerusalem, that topmost of cities should be destroyed? Well, we find that the biblical Zionism kind of, as much as Jerusalem and such are sacred and all that other stuff, and you respect your, the blood and soil stuff you step aside from in true Zionism. Tune, you're setting that shining example. It really seems so, and if this festival was the good time of the Messianic reign, did he mean that the Jews were to be destroyed and the Gentiles brought in? No. Other tribes, yes. Gentiles, not the same thing as Goyim, has nothing to do with who your ancestors were. It really seemed so. After the destruction of the city, the servants were ordered to go into the outlets, where the streets ran into the country, and bring in the outsiders. Jesus thus adds fuel to the flame of the wrath of his enemies. Trench guards his readers against being misled by the English word highways, as if this referred to the country, or as the whole scene is represented as lying in a city. But this usually accurate and learned writer seems to have forgotten that the city is represented to have been burned before those servants go out into the highways. The original Greek word means outways as well as throughways. But another lesson is made from this narrative. When the house became crowded, the king went in to survey the guests and found a man without the wedding garment. Now, let us also remember that Jerusalem and certain other and most, significant places that people have decided are for pilgrimage, whether there's actual religious authority for it or not, it becomes more of a thing. It's about the people who don't live there, as far as the attendance to the city, right? Anyways, back to our parable. He addressed him in language at once gentle and searching. He called him friend, but in the Greek, the not having is put in a word which suggests not simply the absence of the wedding dress, but some defect in the behavior of the guest in allowing himself to be present without such a dress. The clothing also, the body of the stories of the scripture and stuff like this, and the poetry and all that. Not poetry as in there's meaningless stuff in there for style reasons or something. We're indebted to Trench for calling attention to the fact that it is the subjective and not the objective particle of negation which here is used. Akon signifies not having without being conscious of the absence of anything or the necessity of its being present. Akon signifies intentional, not having what one knows one should have. The speechlessness of the guest indicates that he had not even a specious apology to offer. The narrative assumes that the garments were at the guest's command, and therefore that the king himself had provided them. There seems to be no trace of such a custom exactly in this form, but we do know that splendid garments were reckoned among the treasures of Eastern chieftains and kings, that some of them possessed immense numbers of robes, that the gift of costly raiment was a mark of honor, and that a mantle presented by a king was to be worn in his presence, and that a failure to appear therein was considered offensive. An illustration of these points, read Judges 14:12, Job 27:16, Genesis 14:22, 2 Kings 5:5, 2 Chronicles 9:24, Matthew 6:19, Acts 20:33, James 5:1 and 2. In addition to what we read in the Old Testament, tonic is in a different order. There are some things that the Catholic Septuagint and later versions, intentionally changed to, some degree to be a little bit leading. Horace, in his epistles 1:6 and 40, tells us that Lucullus found in his wardrobe not less than 5,000 mantles. The fashions did not change as with us, and a man of wealth might accumulate and preserve an immense wardrobe. The customs of the East are so changeless. Well, exaggeration, right? But certainly harsher climates of heat and cold and wind and stuff like this. People remember, oh, well, this is the hot weather clothes. And nowadays, they're oppressing women by protecting them from the elements. It's like, well, the women choose to do that, and the ones that don't get heat stroke and all that other stuff that the ones here do. That we find the same state of affairs today, a modern writer, Chardin, acknowledged to be unusually well-informed and accurate, says of the king of Persia, the number of dresses he gives away is infinite. Well, Voyage en Perse, Volume 3, page 230, his words are, Le nombre des habitants qu'il donne est infini. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. Someone needs to teach me French. The same writer tells of a vizier who lost his life from failing to wear a garment which had been sent to him by the king. He tells us that the officer through whose hands the robe from the king was to be sent, out of spite forwarded a plain dress instead. The vizier thought that if he appeared in that, it would announce that he was in disgrace at court, and so made his public entry in a robe presented by the late king. His enemies represented to the monarch that his minister had refused to wear his gift, which so incensed him that he ordered the vizier to be executed for the manner in which the rejection of a monarch's gift was resented. See Herodotus 1:9, chapter 3. The whole picture in the parable is in accord with Oriental customs and represents the punishment of willful unworthiness. The guest was willing to have the good of the feast if he could enjoy it in his own way and on his own terms, which were derogatory to the honor of the king and injurious to the pleasure of the other guests. He was a bold, perhaps a desperate intruder, he who could dare enter the banqueting saloon of his king in such shameful style might offer resistance as the Jews showed when they were about to be ejected from a position which they were not worthy to maintain. It was going to be given to the Ishmaelites, and then it was going to become a international thing. And it wasn't going to be about tribe or land anymore. But resistance would be ineffectual. He was to be bound and forced out and left in the dark. If weak, he would wail. If strongly passionate, he would gnash his teeth. The marriage feast is a sifting process, so God sifts and sifts. And sifts. Only those who were willing to partake of the joys of the universe and willing to take them in the way of God's appointing, a way intended to heighten the individual and general joy, only such shall remain in the high feast of the kingdom of the heavens. Then the Pharisees went and took counsel how they might entangle Jesus in his talk, and they watched him and sent to him a company of spies made up of their own sect and of the Herodians. The latter represented a political party whose highest hope was in the continuation of the rule of the Herodian family. And that's not the Shia-Sunni split, by the way.